Now, BBC Radio 2 DJ Steve Wright has sadly died, aged 69, after bringing pure and total joy to listeners for more than 40 years, my friends.
He joined the BBC in the 1970s, was on the air for more than 40 years. Well, joining us now is radio DJ, broadcaster and friend, Neil Fox. Neil, thank you so much for talking to us. I think lots of people have just responded really with shock, but also heartbreak. This man, to work with him, I mean, he's changed and really shaped the radio industry that, you know, people are working in now or listening to, and was just, by all accounts, an extremely hard-working man who was extremely generous too.
Yeah, I think the word legend is way overused nowadays, but he really was a genuine broadcasting legend who has sort of done it, I call the old school way, which was, you know, finding his way into local radio, building up to Radio Luxembourg, ending up at the BBC, cutting his teeth, and just being really, really good at what he did. I knew him as I guess, a sort of a rival and a colleague. I was never one of his work mates. But in all the times that I met him, he was a really genuinely nice guy who loved radio, loved what he did, seemed to be universally liked by all his colleagues. No one ever had a bad or a niggly word about him. He was a kind guy, and he was brilliant on the radio. So, you know, he was. Some people try and do TV and radio. He was a radio man through and through, and he was absolutely brilliant at broadcasting. You know, when I was growing up and trying to get into radio, Steve Wright was one of those guys I was really listening to. He loved American radio and the sound of that like I liked it. But he was the guy that had brought over what they call this zoo format from America. So a show he did on Radio 1 for 12 years, that sort of Steve Wright and the Afternoon Boys, Ashra, that is correct. All these clever
Mr.
catchphrases.
Angry from Pearly, Foxy. Do you remember all of them?
All that, Sid the Manager, all these great
Brilliant
characters we remember. And what's great about radio, as opposed to TV, I have to be honest, is radio is there, as you know, Jeremy, every day of your life, when you wake up, when you're in bed, when you're in the car, when you're having a shower. It's there with you sort of 24/7.
Do you know, Foxy, somebody once told me, your old mate, Tarrant, and I'll never forget this, and this, you're so right about Wrighty, because he was a legend. Barely you should use that word, but this guy was so approachable. If you listened to Steve Wright in the afternoon, Sunday Love Songs, whatever it was, you would assume that Steve Wright literally took his coat off, walked through the door and just did it. He was that natural. Actually, what he did was he practiced and his content was amazing. I just want to tell a story about Tarrant. When Tarrant left Capital Radio that Foxy was on after 17 years, I remember interviewing a lady who was a listener of Tarrant's, and she said, you know what? It was my life. I passed my GCSEs, my A-levels, I got engaged, I got married, I got divorced, I had my first child, and Chris Tarrant was there every day. Steve Wright is one of the probably a handful of legendary radio presenters who I think most people, Foxy, would be able to say he was there. I'm with you. In the 80s, that Steve Wright in the afternoon, I will never forget that show, bud. Never.
Yeah. It was a brilliant show, and it's so right that I think people like him, and there aren't many people who have been around like that. Wogan was one, Tarrant was one, Steve Wright was one, that have been there through all different parts of people's lives. You grow up with these people, and they're there every day, and I think you really know them as the friend on the radio. You feel like you know them really well, because also he'd talk about his wife, he'd talk about his kids, he'd talk about his life. So you feel you kind of know him. And if you met him in the street, and I've seen him in the street wandering along, people coming up and saying hello, he was always very happy to chat with people and talk with people, because they were his audience, and he really understood that. He was just a master of his craft. And I think, well, like me yesterday when I heard this news, I was just firstly very sad because, I mean, he's only 69, so he was a young guy. But also I think there can't be many people in this country that hadn't at some point listened to Steve Wright and the Afternoon Boys, or whether it was on Radio 1 or Radio 2 or the Love Songs. And him actually, genuinely, you can say he was part of so many millions of people's lives. And I suppose it is like losing a friend.
That is summed up.
So true.
perfectly. For me, it was just Sunday mornings and that wonderful accompaniment, and you just felt like, oh, I'm part of this. He was so good at creating that kind of that atmosphere.
You know, the thing is, though, what Foxy said, which is right. So I don't know how old Neil is, probably the same as me, but he went from Radio 1 and Mr. Angry from Pearly and Sid the Manager, as Foxy said, and then we all transcended to Radio 2 because it was perfect, because he was still playing those songs from the 70s and 80s. He transcended, to me, the station, the time of day, the decade. He just had something that listen, I met him at Radio 210 in Reading when I was 18, and you would think as a T-boy, he was the most approachable, down-to-earth bloke in the history of the world, and I don't think there'll be many left like him, seriously.
I think also...
Yeah, I think it's very true.
Neil, what we're learning is just how hardworking he was. So a show that started at 2, he'd actually get in at 9. And so that kind of atmosphere that you've talked about,
Yeah,
the atmosphere you've talked about, Jeremy, of it kind of just sounding like, oh, I've just arrived.
That's the secret, though.
He really crafted that.
Evans does that, doesn't he, Foxy? Taron, the ones who you think are just in the door, get on it, are actually far more into it than you would ever imagine, right?
Yeah, I think sounding that relaxed and that off the cuff takes an awful lot of planning. Like the greatest comedians will always tell you, you know, you rarely have people that literally can wander on stage or walk in a studio and just do it. All that off the cuff stuff has to be very well prepared. And he was a master of his craft. I mean, he was someone who loved radio. Nowadays, I think people like to call themselves broadcasters. I think he's one of those guys, like myself, that would like to go just very happy to be called a jock, because that's what his craft was. He was a radio DJ, a disc jockey, and a jock for short. And he was a bloody brilliant one. He really was.
Do you know what? I could not, and I'm so glad you said that, because you made the point. Listen, I started, he knows, started out as a radio DJ, got into television, but actually, essentially, the very DNA of Steve Wright is a DJ, as a radio jock with his headphones. And I just think there will be millions of people who will have a moment in their mind. They listened to him, they knew him, he felt like somebody they respected and knew. That's what I think.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think in our modern sort of multimedia landscape, where radio, certainly to younger people, doesn't mean quite so much, because maybe they're getting their music and their entertainment through TikTok and social media. I think what's really interesting is radio still holds this incredible place that if you do it properly, and he did it properly, and he was brilliant and a master of it, that it's still one of the most incredible, warm mediums that you can have. You genuinely feel like there is your friend on the radio. He's keeping you company, whether in your car or home or at work or in the factory or in the bathroom bed or wherever you are, ups and downs, they're with you. And they have that incredible personality to be your mate. And it's a really rare skill. And he will be missed.
Foxy, couldn't have put it better myself. And an absolute pleasure and privilege to have you on, my friend. Love to the family, and thank you so much for taking time.
Pleasure.
Dr. Fox there, brilliant, brilliant.
Tony Blackburn, so many tributes we could pick from, but Tony Blackburn says, I'm so sad my dear friend Steve Wright has passed away. He was a great broadcaster and we just loved one another's company. I was shocked at the news. I will miss him terribly.
Thank you again to Dr. Fox.